Hello, my friend. I am Antonio Carlos, and today I invite you to travel with me to an old plantation deep within the damp forest, where the silence seemed to breathe along with the earth. Prepare yourself, because today's story begins with a whisper that turned into a storm. At Santa Amalia Plantation, dawn had a weight of its own. The mist curled around the slave quarters like a sorrowful veil, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the scent of wet firewood. Among the sheds walked Rosa, a young enslaved woman known for the stubborn tenderness with which she cared even for the smallest creatures. Some said she saw beauty where others saw only pain. That morning, however, she walked with a tightened heart, for she had heard screams coming from the big house even before the rooster crowed. Señora Amalia, a woman with harsh features and a voice that allowed no reply, had one son, Pedro, an 8-year-old boy who had been born fragile and who, over the months, had lost weight until he looked more bone than flesh. The village doctors had visited the house twice, leaving behind confusing diagnoses and useless teas. Each passing week, the boy withered before his mother's eyes, and the big house, once proud, now echoed with a kind of fear no one dared name. Called in haste that morning, Rosa climbed the veranda steps with careful steps. She found the lady undone, pointing to the boy's room without saying a word. The room smelled of cold medicine and sleepless nights. Pedro breathed with difficulty, his thin skin revealing ribs drawn as if in charcoal. His large eyes tried to follow every movement of the young enslaved woman. "Rosa," he murmured, his voice as scratchy as a dry leaf. She knelt beside the bed, adjusting the sheet with the delicacy of someone handling an injured bird. The lady watched from afar, biting her handkerchief, unable to admit her own helplessness. For some reason, even she didn't understand. The boy seemed to calm down when Rosa was near. And in that moment, before that thread of life about to snap, Amalia set her pride aside. She would allow Rosa to care for him, however she saw fit. Throughout the morning, Rosa prepared a thin porridge with herbs she had learned from her grandmother, back in the land she never forgot. She hummed softly, almost like a prayer, while the boy tried to drink small spoonfuls. With each sip, his eyes gained a faint but real glimmer. When the sun was already high, Pedro fell asleep, breathing with a bit more steadiness. The lady observed everything in silence. It was strange to see her own son accept so naturally the touch of someone society insisted was inferior. But in that suffocating room, hierarchies seemed to melt away, leaving behind only the fight for life. When Rosa stood to leave, she felt a gentle tug on her skirt. Pedro, still drowsy, held the fabric with his thin hand. "Don't leave me alone," he whispered. The phrase hit the room like a brick. The lady held her breath. Rosa froze for a moment, unsure whether she had permission to reply. But before she could ask, something happened, something small but powerful as distant thunder. The lady nodded, giving her permission to stay. And so began a bond that would forever change the fate of that plantation. But what would come next? Ah, my friend, no one could have predicted. Because the gesture the boy would make for Rosa days later would leave the entire household, from the kitchen to the lady's veranda, in absolute shock. The following days were marked by an unsettling silence at Santa Amalia Plantation. Rosa's constant presence in Pedro's room bothered some servants and made others curious. The lady, however, said nothing. She merely watched, torn between the shame of needing an enslaved girl and the relief of seeing her son finally improve. Rosa's routine became nearly monastic. At sunrise, before helping with laundry in the slave quarters, she climbed to the big house to check the boy's condition. She brought root teas, warm cloths, light broths, and, above all, a calmness that seemed to come from another world. Pedro, once restless and feverish, now slept with fewer jolts, and when he woke, he asked for her as if she were essential to his healing. The contrast between the boy's fragility and Rosa's serene strength stirred a mixture of respect and suspicion among the others. Some enslaved people feared the lady's attention might turn into punishment for the young woman. Others silently prayed for the boy's recovery, because they knew the master's suffering always spilled onto those living in chains. One afternoon, while Rosa dampened a cloth to cool Pedro's fever, the boy asked something that made her pause. "Rosa, why do you sing to me?" She smiled, adjusting a strand of his hair. Because my grandmother said singing heals what the eye can't see. It heals fear, tiredness, and sometimes the heart. Pedro closed his eyes, absorbing every word. The room, once filled with heavy air and a sense of abandonment, now had a different warmth, as if something invisible protected it. Rosa felt the change, and so did the lady, though she pretended not to. But not everything was peace. In the corridors of the house, whispers began to form. Servants murmured that the master would not approve of such closeness between his heir and an enslaved woman. There were stories of old punishments, harsh and unjust, and their memory hung over Rosa like a shadow. One night, Rosa was startled by a noise coming from the boys' room. She ran there, fearing the worst. She found Pedro sitting up, eyes wide, breathing fast. He had had a nightmare. Without thinking, Rosa embraced him, rocking him gently. The lady, who had come to check the candles, saw the scene from the doorway. Instead of interrupting, she remained still. Her eyes filled with tears, something rare for a woman who wore hardness like armor. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe guilt, or maybe it was simply the realization that her son had found comfort where she, with all her wealth and authority, could not reach. And in that instant, Pedro did something unexpected. He reached out to his mother and asked her to stay too. It was the first time in months they shared the same space without the weight of illness suffocating them. And Rosa, there between them, held that fragile balance as if carrying the world in her hands. Little did they know the gesture that would truly shake the foundations of that house was yet to come, and it would be born precisely from this unlikely bond. That unexpected closeness stirred rumors that spread like smoke through the kitchens, orchards, and the narrow corridors of the slave quarters. But while the plantation boiled with speculation, in Pedro's cramped room, a slow transformation was taking place, one no one dared speak aloud. The boy, once nearly immobile, began to show small signs of autonomy. He lifted his head more firmly, held the spoon with more strength, and even smiled, shyly, whenever Rosa entered. Yet Senor Alvaro, Pedro's father, remained distant. A man of few words and many fears, he avoided facing his son's frailty. He preferred to bury himself in the fields, inspecting crops or arguing with overseers. But that morning, returning from the village, he overheard his wife talking about the boy's improvement. What surprised him most was hearing Rosa's name tied to every detail. "So," he grunted, frowning, "now we depend on enslaved hands to do what doctors could not?" Sina Amalia lowered her eyes. It was no secret her husband carried a pride stiff as dry wood. Admitting that a young girl from the slave quarters had soothed their son was far too bitter a pill to swallow. Even so, disturbed by the comment, he decided to see the boy with his own eyes. When he entered the room, he found Pedro sitting up, propped on tall pillows, breathing better. Rosa stood beside him, fixing the sheets. At the sight of his father, the boy smiled, small but sincere. "Papa, Rosa helped me sleep without pain." Alvaro felt a strange pang. He didn't know whether it was gratitude, shock, or wounded pride. He tried to hide it. "She did only what she should," he replied sharply. Rosa bowed her head, unable to look at the master. She felt the weight of his words, but stood firm, for the boy needed the serenity he always found in her. The master stepped closer, studying her. "Tell me, what are you doing that those doctors couldn't?" Rosa inhaled slowly, measuring each word, fearing any misstep could become a sentence. "Massa, I only try to bring him peace. My grandmother taught me that sometimes the body gets better when the heart is not alone." The simple answer struck the room like a stone thrown into a still lake. Alvaro didn't like it, not because it was untrue, but because it unsettled him. Perhaps he himself, in his hardness, had contributed to the boy's decline. That night, tension spread through the house. The master paced restlessly, haunted by his thoughts. The lady stayed near the boy's room, watching Rosa with new eyes, not with suspicion, but with the unsettling feeling that she owed the young woman something. And that night, before the lamplight died, something happened that would change everything. Pedro, waking from a mild fit of coughing, reached out for Rosa and in a firm voice for the first time in a long while said, "Rosa is not my servant. She is my friend." The word echoed like thunder. Friend. Friend. Spoken by a white boy from the big house, referring to a young enslaved woman. Friend, in a world where even the air separated master and slave. The lady brought a hand to her mouth. Rosa froze, and behind the cracked door, someone heard it. Someone who shouldn't have. And that eavesdropper would ignite the conflict that would soon grow beyond anything Rosa could cure. The person who overheard the innocent but explosive phrase was Giustino, the assistant overseer, a bitter man who fed his authority through the fear of others. He had never liked Rosa's serenity, for it softened the tensions he preferred to cultivate. Hearing the boy call her friend twisted something inside him like a snake coiling. Giustino descended the stairs with heavy steps. His mind churned dark possibilities. If he could manipulate the master, he could strengthen his control over the plantation. After all, nothing was more useful to men like him than the emotional instability of their superiors. Meanwhile, in the boys' room, Rosa tried to pretend she wasn't terrified. She knew the weight of that word. She knew how friendships between such distant worlds were seen as threats. She tried to ask the boy not to repeat it, but he, with pure innocence, answered, "Rosa, why would I hide what I feel?" She gave a small, sad smile. She wanted to explain everything, the danger, the world, the unjust boundaries, but could not bring herself to burden a child who had only just begun to breathe without pain. The next morning, as sunlight painted the plantation in gold, Giustino seized the first moment to approach the master. "Sinho, I heard some strange things yesterday. That boy's getting too attached to that slave. You mean to tell me you'll allow that kind of intimacy in your own house?" The provocation hit exactly where intended. The master, already shaken by his pride, exploded inside. Outwardly, he remained rigid, but his eyes darkened. "What sort of intimacy?" he demanded. Giustino, sensing the opening, fanned the flame. He called her his friend, Massa, as if she were equal. And Rosa, well, she doesn't deny anything. She stays there acting like she owns the room. It was a lie. Rosa had never crossed a single line, but the seed had been planted, and seeds watered by wounded pride grow far too fast. Before the master could act, something unexpected interrupted him. Pedro, determined to walk along the veranda that morning, felt his legs fail. He collapsed into Rosa's arms before hitting the floor. Her scream echoed through the big house. The lady ran, the master ran, servants rushed from everywhere. The boy was conscious but weak, very weak. "Let me stay with her," he murmured. It was the second time in less than a day that he asked for Rosa, in front of everyone. The silence that followed could have knocked down the walls. Seeing her son's desperation, the lady broke every convention. She grabbed Rosa's hand and commanded, "Take care of him, now." The look she gave her husband was not a request. It demanded silence. The master hesitated, but the pain of seeing his son so fragile spoke louder than pride. For the first time since Rosa entered that room, the family surrendered to the undeniable truth. The boy only improved when she was there. But Giustino, one step behind, watched with narrowed eyes. And from that moment on, he decided he would do anything to destroy that bond. Because some hearts, my friend, simply cannot stand to see hope grow where they prefer to plant fear. The tension gripping Santa Amalia plantation did not come only from Pedro's fragility, but from everyone's uneasy gaze at Rosa's constant presence. Since the boy's collapse, she scarcely left his side. She spent hours preparing warm infusions, renewing compresses and singing songs that floated through the air like gentle mist. And the boy, still weak, seemed to cling to every syllable to avoid slipping back into the darkness that had nearly consumed him. The lady watched with a mix of guilt and admiration. She had never been patient with her son's ailments, always expecting his strength to match the firm composure she herself displayed. Now, seeing how the boy responded to Rosa's care, she felt her chest tighten. Perhaps she had denied her own son the affection he had silently begged for. Perhaps that hurt the most. That late afternoon, when orange light poured through the windows, the lady called Rosa to the sewing room. a space that smelled of old thread and wood kept too long. Rosa entered with cautious steps, her hands still marked by warm steam from the compresses. Amalia took a deep breath before speaking. "Rosa, what did you do to my son?" The question, though stern, carried fragility. Rosa tried to answer, but the words eluded her. "Mistress, I only cared for him as I would care for anyone who was sick. He's a child, he's scared, he needs holding." The simplicity of the statement shook the lady, who averted her eyes as if hearing a truth she had never wanted to confront. "And why does he trust you so much?" Rosa said nothing. She thought of replying that trust grows where love is allowed space, but she held her tongue. In that world, love and slavery rarely belonged in the same sentence. Before the lady could continue, a servant rushed in saying the master urgently needed her. Amalia left quickly, and Rosa remained alone for a few moments. The silence was so deep she could hear her own heartbeat, restless. She knew Giustino had been spreading malicious comments. She knew the master mistrusted everything, and with each passing day, her bond with the boy deepened, and with it, the danger. When Rosa returned to the room, she found Pedro awake, eyes shining despite his fatigue. "I tried to stand today," he said proudly. "Almost managed." She sat beside him, running her hand through his fine hair. "You will, yes. You just need to move at your body's pace." He squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "You're not going away, are you?" The question sent a tremor through Rosa's chest. Before she could respond, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. The master appeared at the doorway, followed by Giustino, whose smile looked like a blade wrapped in cloth. "I need to speak with you," the master said in a tone that allowed no refusal. Pedro, alarmed, tried to sit up. "Papa, don't speak harshly to her. Rosa is—" But Alvaro silenced him with a raised hand. Rosa stood slowly. She saw Giustino's sharp eyes and knew something was coming, something big, something that could turn her life upside down. And as she followed the master into the hallway, she felt she might be walking toward the most decisive moment of her life, uncertain whether it would lead her to recognition or ruin. The master led Rosa to the study, a dark room smelling of old ink, farm maps, and a silence that threatened before any words were spoken. Giustino stayed at the door like a guard awaiting the sentence. Rosa didn't know where to place her hands, didn't know how to breathe without looking guilty of something she didn't understand. The master paced back and forth. "Rosa, people say you're taking advantage of my son's fragility." Each syllable struck her like a silent blow. She lifted her gaze, trying to understand how far the accusation would go. "Massa, I never—" Giustino cut her off. "With all due respect, Massa, we know how these girls are. They use tricks, manipulate feelings. This kind of attachment isn't good for the boy. It goes against the order of the house." The statement triggered something in the master, not certainty, but fear. Fear of losing his son, fear of admitting that a young enslaved woman had done what doctors, medications, and his own authority could not. Fear that the boy depended on her more than on his parents. "Rosa," he said, approaching, "why does my son only calm down when you're with him?" She breathed deeply. It was time to answer with her soul, even if it cost her dearly. "Because the boy feels loved, Massa, and love that doesn't choose skin or house or chain." The silence that followed was so heavy, even Giustino seemed breathless. The master looked away, as if the feeling exposed him too much. Before he could reply, a scream echoed from the hallway. The boy is unwell!" All three ran. In the room they found Pedro curled in bed, breathing hard but conscious. His eyes sought only one person. "Rosa," he whispered. The scene shattered any prepared speech. The lady grabbed her husband's arm, desperate. "Alvaro, for God's sake, and let her stay!" Rosa hurried to the boy, placed a hand on his forehead, and asked him to breathe slowly. The whole room froze. His breathing gradually stabilized. The trembling stopped. His face relaxed. And then, in front of everyone, the master, the lady, the servants, and Giustino, Pedro made the gesture that silenced every judgment. He took Rosa's hand and placed it on his chest, as if giving her his own life, and said, "She is my family." The words struck like lightning. family. A word that crossed forbidden borders, a word no one expected to hear. The master stepped back as if the floor had cracked. The lady wept openly, and Giustino's mask crumbled, hatred spilling across his face. Rosa, holding back tears, squeezed the boy's hand. For the first time, she felt that their bond was more than affection. It was destiny, and it would be this gesture, his thin hand over hers, that would change everything from that moment on. After the boy spoke those words, "She is my family," the big house plunged into a different kind of silence, thick as mist. It wasn't just shock. It was as if every brick had to rearrange itself to accept a new truth. In the slave quarters, rumors traveled fast. Some whispered with hope, others with fear. The white boy had called an enslaved woman family. That night, as the wind howled through the window cracks, the plantation seemed split into two even more distant worlds. In Pedro's room, Rosa sat beside the bed, singing softly, as if trying to hold on to life by its edge. The lady stayed in a chair near the window, eyes lost, hands twisted in her lap. The master had withdrawn early, saying nothing. Giustino did not sleep. He paced before the slave quarters, chewing on dark thoughts. To him, this was an affront. If an enslaved woman could be called family without punishment, what would stop others from rising? His power depended on keeping the house and the slave quarters worlds apart. Bringing them closer was a threat. The next morning, the master summoned the priest from the small chapel near the plantation. He wanted advice, or perhaps a confirmation he still had control over something. The priest, a gentle-spoken man with sharp eyes, listened to the filtered version of events. Then he said, "Sometimes God uses hands the world despises to save what the world values too much." The master frowned. "Are you telling me to accept this confusion? This closeness?" The priest sighed. "I'm telling you it may not be confusion. It may be a lesson." Meanwhile, Rosa helped Pedro take small steps inside the room. He trembled but insisted, determined despite his frailty. "I want to reach the window today," he said. She supported him by the waist, guiding each step. Sunlight filtered through the curtains onto his pale face. When they reached the window, he breathed deeply, as if discovering the world anew. "Rosa, if I ever get strong again, I promise no one will order you around anymore." Her heart tightened. She didn't want to crush the promise with talk of laws, papers, and invisible chains. Instead, she answered with gentle sadness, "Boy, some promises we make with our mouth, and some we make with our heart. The one from your heart already counts." Later, the master entered the room with the priest. He saw his son standing, supported by Rosa, and something moved inside him. Pride, humiliation, hunger for control. "Pedro," he began, "we need to talk." The boy turned slowly, still leaning on Rosa. The priest stepped back. The lady stood near the door, tense. "They're saying," continued the master, "that you've been saying things that shouldn't be said. Words mixing what belongs inside this house with what belongs outside." The boy frowned. "You're talking about Rosa?" "Yes, about her, and about how you're confusing people's places." Pedro gathered courage in his fragile chest. "Father, have you ever been afraid of dying?" The master was caught off guard. "That's not what we're discussing." "But I am," the boy insisted. "I was afraid, very afraid. And when I was most afraid, the one who stayed with me was Rosa. Not a doctor, not medicine, and sometimes not even you, Mother." The lady lowered her eyes, crushed by guilt. The priest watched in silence. Pedro continued, "If family is the one who doesn't leave when we're scared, then Rosa is my family." The master felt the blow. Giustino, listening from the hallway, clenched his jaw. This was no longer an isolated affection. It was a principle, a rule set by a child challenging centuries of custom. That night, after everyone slept, the master and Giustino met in the study. Shadows stretched too large in the lamplight. "Massa, you must decide," said Giustino. "If this continues, that boy will think he commands more than you." "And what do you propose?" the master growled. "Send the girl away, to another plantation. far, with no chance to escape. Away from the boy's eyes, he'll forget. The master said nothing, but the idea hung in the air like poison. But what no one knew was that Pedro, unable to sleep, overheard part of the conversation. The words, "send away," and "another plantation," pierced his chest like silent arrows. He returned to his room pale but determined. In that moment, alone, he made a decision. If the adult world insisted on separation, he would use the only thing he had, his own life. And the gesture he would make to protect Rosa would not only shock the entire plantation, it would test faith, power, and conscience. The next morning, Santa Amalia plantation was unusually busy. The priest remained to hold a small mass at the lady's request, seeking protection for the boy. The village doctor had been summoned again. Servants carried benches, opened windows that rarely saw daylight. When Pedro heard the priest and doctor were present, he surprised everyone. "I want to go downstairs. I want to be in the room with everyone." The lady hesitated. The master frowned, but the priest supported the idea. Rosa dressed the boy gently. Every gesture she made felt like a farewell she didn't dare name. "Rosa, if I stumble, will you hold me?" "I will, like I always do." With Rosa on one side and the priest on the other, Pedro descended the stairs. Each step pulled silent gasps from those watching. Enslaved workers had been called to help arrange the room and now stood along the walls, silent witnesses to something they did not yet understand. In the center of the room, they placed a tall chair for the boy. Around him stood the master, the lady, the priest, the doctor, and the servants. Rosa stayed behind him until he turned and said, "Stay here, beside me." That alone was bold enough. But what he would do next would break every boundary known on that plantation. The priest prayed for health, peace, understanding. When he finished, the boy inhaled deeply, and before any adult could speak, raised his voice. "I want to speak too." The master tried to interrupt. "Son, this isn't the time." "It is. It's the only time I have." The sharp certainty in his tone silenced the master. The doctor watched with interest. The priest clutched his rosary. Rosa's heart pounded. "Father, mother, priest, everyone," he began. "I know I might die." The lady gasped. "Don't say that, my boy." "But it's true. And when someone almost dies, they start to see what others don't. I saw." He pointed at Rosa. "She held me when I was falling. She stayed when everyone else left. She sang so I wouldn't be afraid. She cared for me as if I were her own child. So today, in front of everyone, I want to ask for something." Silence thickened. "If I am the heir of this plantation, if what is yours will be mine one day, Father, then I want to use that now. I want to trade anything I would inherit for what I'm about to ask." The master shifted in his seat. "What request is that?" Pedro straightened, trembling. "I want Rosa's freedom. I want her letter of manumission. Today." The room collapsed into shock. Servants froze. The lady covered her mouth. The priest closed his eyes. Justino turned pale with hatred. "This is absurd," the master roared. "You don't understand what you're asking. You don't change the order of things like this." But the boy continued. "If Rosa leaves this place as a slave, I will no longer take medicine. I won't eat. I won't stand up. I'd rather die." The phrase cut through the room like a blade. "Don't say that," the lady cried. "I will, because living in a place where the one who saved me remains in chains isn't living." Even the doctor murmured that the boy's condition was too delicate to contradict him. The priest added quietly, "Sometimes God places truth where we least expect." The master walked to the window, breathing deeply. He knew the boy wasn't threatening for attention. He was deadly serious, and losing him, losing his heir, was unthinkable. Minutes passed like hours. Finally the master turned, eyes red. "Bring paper, pen, and ink." A murmur rippled through the room. Rosa stood frozen. A servant returned with the materials. The master sat at the table and wrote, each stroke a battle. The priest stood as witness. The lady wept openly. Justino's eyes burned with helpless fury. The master finished, signed, and sealed. "Rosa," he called. She stepped forward. "Here it is. Your manumission letter. You are free. The word carried a new weight. Free. Not as a promise, but as written fact. Rosa held the paper with trembling hands. The enslaved workers along the wall felt a shiver of hope, knowing it didn't break all chains, but it opened a door. Before Rosa could speak, Pedro, with effort, stood from the chair and embraced her, resting his thin face against her waist, as if she were the safest place on earth. That gesture, the air embracing the woman who had been the slave only yesterday, shocked the entire household, because it wasn't just a boy hugging his caregiver. It was an ancient world being forced to confront itself. Days later, Pedro began to show clearer signs of recovery, still fragile but with a desire to live that seemed to bloom from his fight for Rosa. The freedom letter was stored carefully in a small trunk in the modest room Rosa now occupied. No longer the slave quarters, but a room behind the kitchen, a door she could open or close by choice. She decided to stay a while, working as a free woman, earning modest wages, tending to the kitchen, and caring for the boy who had called her family before the world. But inside, knowing she could leave whenever she wished, felt like breathing fresh air after a long night. And so, my friend, in that forgotten corner of land, a gesture made by a skeletal boy, whom everyone thought was at death's edge, rewrote the destiny of a woman marked by the slave quarters, and planted in the hearts of all who saw it a question that refuses to be silenced. How many lives would be different if the courage to love were greater than the fear of breaking chains? I am Antonio Carlos, and this has been another story from the Vidas da Senzala channel. If this story touched your heart, share it, comment what you felt, and keep walking with us through these memories that time tried to silence, but we insist on telling.